As you know, my basic theme is words, what words do. I think, as was mentioned here before, sticks and stone may break my bones, but words will never harm me, was correct at one time, about 15,000 years ago. That's before man began to speak. That's what they were involved in. But since then, things have changed. Man has developed something called speech. Speech is one of the most powerful weapons man has. And he uses it for good or for evil. Mostly, in the last few centuries, it's been used for evil. There were times when people actually, by the middle of the 19th century, there were those who felt that because of the Industrial Revolution and because of the fact that integration was taking place, economic, social, and even political integration was taking place, eventually all hatred will disappear. And of course, the proponents of this were those people who were hated, the Jewish intellectuals. It didn't happen. It didn't happen because the thought was that once religious hatred is gone, everything will be fine. Well, let's go back to the French Revolution for a moment. Remember the famous words? Equality, brotherhood, the whole 9 yards. Read some of the stuff that was being said, particularly about the Jews. To the Jewish individual, everything, said the French Revolution. To the Jews as a group, nothing. Jews need to disappear. That was the French Revolution. And that's what was happening. New ideas, new concepts. Religion is of no consequence. It is now a new world. No. Voltaire, who didn't believe in religion at all, he hated Jews. Had to figure out how and why. And by the end of the 19th century, my friends, you have a number of people who are really the ones who coin the words, who propagate the words that are used to the destruction of the Jews. And who are these people? The first one, of course, is Wilhelm Marr, who coined the word anti-Semitism. Now, I hate the word. The reason I hate the word, because it totally and completely obfuscates the real truth. The truth is, in German, Judenhasse. The hatred of the Jew is what anti-Semitism means. But it sounds so much better. He is followed by another man by the name of Treitschke, another one, who looks upon the Jews who are now integrated into German society, who are integrated into the German financial system, and he says, that's wrong. We don't need them. We need to get rid of them, he says. And he comes up with a magnificent statement. The Jews are our misfortune. Now, those of you who ever read the Stürmer would know that on top it says the Stürmer, which is the name of a newspaper, the Nazi newspaper on top, and the words are there. In the same size letters on the bottom is in German. The Jews are our misfortune. That becomes a basis, the intellectual basis for hatred, the intellectual basis for the Nazi Party, the intellectual base upon which the Holocaust is built. Words. Hatred. It's still the same Judenhasse. Why? Because I guess it was Browning who coined the words, or used the word, the fantasy was created that the Jews somehow represent the ultimate evil. And as Rabbi Lau pointed out, when the Jews were a separate group and wore kaftans and black coats, why don't they become like us? So the Jews become like them. They wore top hats, just like everybody else. Why are they doing this? They're trying to be like us. And he's pointed out, the cry word between the wars throughout Europe was, in every language you wanted to hear in Europe, Jews go to Palestine. Židi to Palestina. In Slovak, in Polish. So now the Jews went to Palestina. So what do we do? Hate them. It continues. It's what is called a chimeric, a perception, absolutely no base. But it works. It unites people in hatred. And that's the scary part for me today. Why? We speak mostly of the right, the extreme right. Because these are the people who are doing some of the killings, the murder. But we forget about the extreme left. Sometimes people make the mistake that they call the extreme left liberal. There's nothing as far as possible in terms of liberal than the far left. They're National Socialists. Remember that word? It's called Nazis. That's where we are. The extreme left and the extreme right have met with a little help for a little fundamental Islam. And that's the fear. All lies put together on a different basis. So the question is, where do we go from here? We speak of education. My friends, education without a moral compass is evil. Education during the Third Reich was brilliant. Brilliant. Education of the Third Reich is being used today by countries. Goebbels' concepts and ideas of education, which is also happens to be propaganda, which is nothing more than controlled education, my friends. It's exactly. I was giving a talk in a school in New York. The students in this particular class, it's English 101, read a number of books. One of the books they read was my memoir called Bandi's Brother. One of the students said, I'm not going to read that book because it's a lie. He happened to have been a Palestinian. Well, the teacher told him, the professor told him, say, you don't have to read the book, you don't have to buy the book. The only thing is that you'll fail the course. And so he decided he's going to read the book. And then I was coming in to answer questions and talk. And of course, he had a whole slew of comments he was making. And in his conversation, he says the following. In 1948, the Jewish state was formed. And the night they formed the state, they attacked 5 Arab countries. I looked at him and I say that slowly again. And he says, yeah, that's. I said, where'd you learn that? My textbook. I say, think about it logically. A country that is born, it has no organized army, it has 0 air force, well, maybe it's 4 planes, but not a single pilot who can fly it. It has no weapons. Does that make sense to you? That it would go and attack 4, 5 organized states and armies that were trained by the British to kill the Jews? Does that make sense to you? And he looked at me and says, That, my friends, is what we need to teach. That's lesson number 1. Logic. Speak of the stuff that is being sold as anti-Israel, anti-Zionism, anti-this, anti-that, but mostly against the Jews. It really doesn't matter what you call it. It's the same word. In German, Judenhasse. Use logic. The counterpoint to the propaganda is logic. Let them explain to you. I was giving a talk at the University of California in Riverdale, and in the audience was the president of Justice for Palestine. And she makes this long comment after I speak about the fact that the Jews obviously are infiltrating what will be someday the Palestinian state. And as a result of it, they're trying to eliminate or prevent the creation of a Palestinian state. I say, that's a problem? I say, well, why should that be a problem? When the Palestinian people will sit down and actually speak to the Jewish people and agree on a set of borders to live in peace and harmony, there'll be some Jews who will be living in the Palestinian territory, right? Well, they have a choice. Stay there, become Palestinian citizens with equal rights, send their children to Palestinian schools and universities, pay taxes. What's wrong with that? He said, oh no, the Jews must never step foot on Palestinian soil. So I said to him, well, that's interesting, you should say that. How about a Palestinian stepping on Israeli soil? That's legitimate, right? That's right. I said, wait a minute. And I really wasn't speaking to her. I was speaking to the other 500 people. I said, tell me, where is the logic? Where is the justice? Where is the equality? After all, they're both human beings. They're both born the same way. She looked at me and says, oops. I stuck my foot into it, she said. She never thought of it because all she knows how to do is spout propaganda and lies. And so the next thing we must do is teach facts. Most of you are too young to remember a program called Dragnet. Anybody remember that? Just the facts, ma'am. Just the facts. We must know them, we must spout them, and our students must know them. And they're not going to get it on the internet. They get it in your classroom. Next problem. I was at a conference at Yad Vashem about 25 years ago, maybe. Around the table stood a bunch of people, mostly teachers from various American schools mostly. And as it turns out, the chairman of the session was a wonderful lady who was a nun. And I'm listening to the conversation. I say, whoa. I say, they were saying like every opinion must be considered. Everybody has a sense of right. I said, well, isn't there something called morality? Do we have no moral code? Do we not have a moral direction? I say, you, the teachers, are the moral compass. Yeah, you got to stick your neck out. But you must be the moral compass, because if you're not, the moral compass is, the haters will be. They'll bring the hatred into your classroom, and unless you explain the difference between moral and immoral, or amoral, and immediately half the teacher says, oh, time out. That's religion. I say, hell no. Morality is morality. And it is not a question of today it's moral to kill somebody and tomorrow it's not. Understand what we're supposed to do. The teacher must be the moral compass. Facts and moral compass. Those two things are critical, essential, without which you will not succeed. Yes, listen. I listened to that kid from the Palestinian kid about saying how Israel attacked the 5 nations. And then I asked him to explain to me the logic of that. Is this really possible? We need to be there and fight this every single day. You know how they say? It's like shaving. When you don't shave one day, no, I don't mean anything. But if you don't shave one day, you look like a bum. I mean, that's the point, my friends. Schools of education, schools of history, schools of political science is not a debating society about chess. We're talking about the life and death of human beings, of states, of individuals, of millions of people around the globe. That's what you're involved in. And unless we realize what our function is, we're doomed. We're doomed. But it's possible to do something about it. Now, we have institutions in the world today that are absolutely the most vile, the most disgraceful institutions we have ever had. It's called the United Nations. It's a place that needs to be disbanded. It is neither united, nor is it made up of nations. It's a debating evil society. And I say it without any fear of being contradicted. Now let me give you an idea of what happened about 1.5 years ago at the UN. Every year or thereabouts, there is part of the UN, one of the many parts of the United Nations organization, because the organization having to do with women. Justice and equality of women in the world. There's only one nation in this whole world that persecutes women. Did you know that? And guess what that country is? Israel. Did you know that? It was voted by the members, 40-some odd members of this organization, voted on the fact that Israel is the place, only place, that persecutes women. The fact that women are almost but not quite allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia is not persecution, not by the UN. That women, young women, they're being mutilated of their genitalia, that's not a problem. That a man in Syria can beat the living daylights out of his wife and even kill her if she disobeys him, that is not a problem. Only Israel. I suppose you could call it that Israel persecutes women because they give them tough jobs, like flying a fighter plane. My friends, it's bad enough that 20 nations voted for it. That would be acceptable. Why? Because they hate Israel. 19 nations, including France and Belgium, abstained. And 4 nations voted against it. This, my friends, actually happened. And the resolution passed. This is where we are. And we're there because we allowed it to happen. We, humanity, allowed it to happen. And so unless we do something, the Holocaust can take place again. My grandchildren, or great-grandchildren, I have 2 of those, and 2 more on the way, may suffer the same fate I did. I hope they survive. If we stand by and do nothing, if we don't teach the past, if we don't understand how the step-by-step process took place, how Treitschke and the rest of them used words that were converted to slogans, that became a national ethos, that murder became a patriotic act, until we do something, until we scream from the top of the rafters, until we teach it in our schools, we're doomed. You know the expression, the Jews are the canaries in the mine. You know what that means, obviously, all of you. The steps we have taken over the past 2,000 years, 3,000 years of developing democracy, some sense of caring for each other, down the drain. The experiment we call America and some other countries, Britain, some questionable, will be gone. The kings will be back saying, off with your head, and they chop your head off. If that's where we want to go, be my guest. Ignore what's going on. I know you don't mean that. I know you don't want to do that. That's why you're here. That's why you went to Auschwitz yesterday, to see the hundreds of the millions of people that are participating in the active murder of the Jewish people. You saw the crematorium there. You saw the mechanization. That was not done by a bunch of hoodlums carrying around baseball bats. When the Wannsee Conference took place on the 20th of January of 1942, by the way, you know why that date took place is because it was supposed to originally be on the 7th of December. But on 7th of December, something else happened. Someplace in Hawaii, you know. 1/3 of the group sitting in that conference had PhDs. So when you tell me education is the solution, hell no. Education with an evil content, which is being practiced by thousands of professors throughout the world, and I dare say, in the United States. Evil, hatred. We must root that out. Colleges and universities need billions of dollars to operate. Columbia University in the last 5 or 8 years just went through a $2 billion investment. I don't want to know where it came from and what prices they paid. I don't think it was an accident that when Ahmadinejad was the president of Iran and had an open microphone at Columbia University, that was totally accidental. I have no proof of anything, but I just wonder. The $2 billion had to come from someplace. Different people spend their money different ways. Different countries spend their money different places. When the country of Iran has a parade and missiles go down the street of Tehran, it says, destination Tel Aviv, the destruction of the Jews. They mean it. This is not just words. They've taken the words, concretized it. And so, my friends, this is a battle to the death. I don't care which is Goliath and which is David. But we better be victorious. And so my prayer is, I call upon the good people of this world who have a conscience, who have a morality, and who have the wherewithal to do what's absolutely essential to save this bloody planet from that evil that's been initiated in the end of the 19th century, put into practice in the 20th century with total impunity. It's being put into practice today in 2019, when the man who would be Prime Minister of England thinks that the murderous Hamas is the savior of the world, and allows them as the future. Great Britain is in trouble, bad trouble. And so something must be done. And something must be done. And I depend on you to do it. Thank you very much.
I do not resist the pleasure to say, dear Irwin, thank you very much for your wise words. Excuse me, this is not a question, it's just a comment that comes from my heart. You spoke eloquently about the notion of the moral compass, and you gave examples afterwards about how that moral compass, even among teachers or among the society, can be distorted by what happens in other places. So you referred to a case in the United Nations and some countries. I feel close to certain issues that you have mentioned. Let me say this, very important with regard to the moral compass. I was sitting in New Jersey a year ago talking with friends, and somebody mentioned a country which is supporting one of the evils that you have been describing, offering $30 million, if I'm not mistaken, to a famous university in the north of the US. You know, just funding research and stuff like that. Once you put $30 million on a table, you have access to the board of administrators or whatever. I don't know how it works in your universities, guys. But this is how the evil today, this is what I was trying to explain earlier. The evil has changed its face. It's no longer stormtroopers parading on the street, although it's still happening in Sweden. I'll recommend you to try and find some videos on YouTube that gives you a sense of what stormtroopers today are doing, you know, in uniforms and so forth. Google it. But today, they're using new platforms in a sophisticated way, like social media and so forth, to disseminate actually their software. But they're using other sophisticated ways to actually interfere with the moral compass. If I come to you with a present and I say, please, this is for us, from our country, it's extremely important to contribute to your not only economic but also intellectual, academic development, we're done, like Irvin said. And these things are not a joke, they are happening. And Irvin knows it, and I've seen it with my own eyes. And so these people have an access, they buy themselves an access to the board of administrators. And then how about talking to their deans about the moral compass? You know what happens at that moment? And this is not a critic, to, of course, to the folks who are around the table. It happened in other places. I haven't heard of any university that is related to you guys that have done this thing, but there are places in Europe where it has already happened, and also in the United States. Actually, people do just like journalists in dictatorships. They do what we call in French, l'autocensure, self-censorship. Actually, they deprive themselves from the opportunity to make certain comments of when somebody says something, as Irvin has eloquently, once again, thank you very, very much for your intervention, described. People reverse their moral compass. So, for example, he has mentioned countries where women are being, excised. That's the technical name. You know, the genitals are being taken away and things like that. Well, if you happen to be in a party and talk to a politician from a famous government or a famous nation or a famous political party, he would look at you and say, "Mr. Maklis, what are you talking about?" "Oh, it's no big deal, it's not an issue," or he will just switch to another conversation. And this is how moral compass has evolved in the last years, and this is the beginning of a phenomenon, just like words, and then you have the election time that puts together, dear Greg, the building blocks in a very, as one of my professors of publicity used to say, Professor Friedman, la publicité subliminale, subliminal publicity. It's happening, you don't see it coming, but it's out there. It's like the issue, if I may, dear David, close on that comment that I like. It's like climate change. Do you guys believe in climate change? It's as usual. You have those who deny it completely, like Donald Trump, for example, and you have those who wants a radical change, just change our way of life, no more cars, no more blah, blah, blah. And you have the vast majority of people, that is us. We sense, we feel, we have the perception that something is going on, but we find it difficult to describe, so we struggle with the words, we struggle with the perceptions, the conferences, and so forth. But tell you what, it is happening. And what Irvin has described, it is happening, and I've seen it with my humble European perspective. Thank you very much.
Irvin, thank you very much. I really have appreciated learning from you and being in your presence. And I've given a lot of thought, given the audience here, of how to connect legal education with higher education and elementary education. And I think you really raised two of the key components that I think are at the center of the struggle for education generally and legal education specifically. And that is really the sense of values. I think that in law school, many of us will study and many of us will teach about Supreme Court decisions that legitimized slavery, that legitimized separation but equal, separate but equal, that knocked down statutes that were designed to protect African Americans from being murdered and lynched in the South. And we'll study those cases, right? And one of my professors in law school, I remember, was talking about Plessy v. Ferguson, the famous case that legitimized separate but equal and Jim Crow in the South. And he talked about the intelligence, the credentials of the 7 justices in the majority, right? Just how they had these impeccable credentials of going to Harvard and going to Yale and just having the wonderful credentials, but what they missed was a sense of morality and a sense of justice that was only articulated by the dissenter, Justice Harlan, Transylvania State University. And he used to use that story to illustrate how law schools have gone off track in terms of emphasizing the cult of the craft, but forgetting that law schools are also supposed to be justice schools. And I think that what you talk about highlights that, the importance of having the sense of justice and morality at the center of education. I want to add a couple of other components that I think are key both to law schools and to higher education generally, in addition to fact-based argumentation, right? That's something we all feel like we're losing, but law schools, it's the center of legal education. What is a fact? What is evidence? How do you muster the evidence to make an argument? That's one of the central things that we teach. But I think two other critical components are asking questions. Question everything you do, right? Question everything you do. And one of the things that I've looked for on this trip is really the examples of dissent, the examples of individuals who, against all the odds and all social pressures and all political pressures, said no, at great risk to themselves. And that all comes from the ability to ask questions and to exercise a healthy sense of skepticism and criticism at every step of the way for every orthodoxy, right? To always continuously question. And then the other component of this is the ability to listen. Listen with an open heart as a way to understand the humanity of each other. And those are key components of legal education, but those are key components, key features that function as a safeguard to humanity and democratic values that I think all of us feel are being squandered right now in society. But I was trying to think of how do we connect the legal education and the educators, and all of us deal with those four issues.
I appreciate the comment, but when I think in terms of words, they have meaning, they have consequences. One of the things we need to understand is that words are like playing chess. I say something, you react. I have to predict what you're going to react. So I have an antidote to a reaction. You have to antidote to my reaction. You have to think in terms of 3-4 steps ahead of you. And that's what we have not figured out how to do. We forget that chess was invented in Persia. That happens to be the forerunner to Iran. If you don't know how to play political chess, you're doomed. Why? Because when you play checkers, as some of our politicians do, and the other party plays chess, you're gonna lose. So we need to understand what these words mean. They have consequences. Agreements have consequences. I was all of 10 years old, not quite 10 years old, when an agreement between Chamberlain, Daladier, Mussolini, and Hitler had major consequences on the 9-year-old. Yes. We need to judge our political leaders based on what they say and what the consequences of their agreements mean. We need to understand that. And when you see that your representative does not understand, as I tell you, I was very disappointed this past Sunday. I participated in a Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial, in New York City at a place called Temple Emmanuel, which I guess it's the largest physical synagogue in America, more or less. And one of our very esteemed politicians gets up and has no idea what the hell he's talking about. He's standing there praising himself that he is the highest elected Jewish official ever been in America. You can figure it out who that is. That's his accomplishment. The fact that some of his cohorts in his political party want to destroy the state of Israel. When they speak of 9/11, oh yeah, some people did something. Of course some people did something. The most horrendous crime, murder of Americans. Some people, and that, my friends, is a representative in the House of American Congress. Some people did something, and the man who claims to be the highest position of whatever it is has nothing to say about that. You know, I think it was my uncle who once said, "You've got to throw those rascals out." Anybody else have a question or thoughts?
To the question of moral education, I think that we have an opportunity, just as we do in legal education, we have an opportunity in teacher education to really think about that and think about what that means from the standpoint of the curriculum. I studied moral education as a teacher education student in the early 90s, and I can tell you that it didn't deal with these questions, right? And so I think we have a disciplinary problem in our field, in the field of education, and we have to really confront how moral education is dealt with. And I think the issue, I agree with you, bringing the issues of justice into the foreplay. And fairness, equity. I think bringing an equity lens and an equity approach to the preparation of teachers. Because what I find with our mostly young white women who want to become teachers is that they come with a conformist mindset, and that is, I go along to get along, and I do whatever I have to do to get the grade. I don't challenge the system. We don't, you know, they don't even challenge issues of sexism, right? I had a hard time getting these students to talk about the ways in which, you know, they are living within a patriarchal system, right? And so I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of getting our students who become teachers to really think about issues of justice and equity and fairness in light of the moral issues. And so I guess I would invite my fellow deans of education in particular to think about a curriculum project around Holocaust education that has at the center, I think, what you're talking about. And I think there's opportunities to partner with our legal scholars, because there's much about the United States legal history that our teachers don't understand, right? In particular, what you talked about in terms of our history around segregation, our history around women's suffrage, and how the law has shaped those things. And so I would invite us to really think proactively and creatively about curriculum as a result of this experience.
Simply because people have rights to say things doesn't mean that what they say is right. And there are phrases that you can use, and the teachers in the classroom, that includes all of us, whether it's a law classroom, and it almost doesn't matter what the class is, the content of what we're talking about, which is why I'm not sure curriculum is the answer. But the question of confrontation and questioning is the answer. And I vividly remember, certainly the lawyers in the room, probably all of us know, the philosopher Ronald Dworkin, the late philosopher Ronald Dworkin. I had a seminar with Ronald Dworkin many, many moons ago, and one poor hapless undergraduate said, well, couldn't you say, and then he followed with a sentence, and Dworkin answered, and this precisely captures the utility of free speech and the hierarchy of what's correct and not. I said, well, of course you could say that, but have you no regard for the truth? And that's the step we have to take. But to do it in the manner of asking further questions to reveal the self-evident contradictions, because we can put content into people until the cows come home, and if they don't understand how to deploy the content, then it will be to no avail. For 10 years, I'll give you the mic in 2 seconds. For 10 years, I sat on a school board in New Jersey, and I remember vividly people talking about computer education. And I naively assumed that it meant how to use a computer, especially as a search tool. No. The teachers wanted to talk about how to turn it on and which software to use. And I said, I was probably a little too forward at that moment, and said, every 8-year-old will run circles around you doing that. You have to do the functional equivalent of what the school library used to be, an already filtered set of content so that they can begin to understand what legitimate versus illegitimate actually is. And I was poo-pooed on that score. No, it's much more important to know, whether you're using Word or WordPerfect. And so I view that as a powerful limit.
That we all know and we see now where there is an attempt to discredit higher education, to discredit what we're doing in the classrooms every day, because they understand the power that we do have. And if we don't understand that power and use it, Google, et cetera, will win. And I maintain that the process is not over yet, but if we don't begin to understand what we have in the classroom, the ability to generate to help develop the next generation of leaders who are able to use critical evidence and facts, we are going to lose, and it will happen again. And so the fact that higher ed is being attacked, we should take that as a sign that we have not become ineffective. Because if we're ineffective, people won't need to continue to attack what you're doing in the classroom. And even in the United States, there is a huge dislike of higher ed amongst individuals who are high up in our leadership in our country, let me put it that way. And so we should take that as a badge of honor. When they stop criticizing us, and I would say, going back to your point, the reason why they are now trying to get into our institutions of higher education by giving large gifts and seeking to potentially play the long game and in the long run control what's happening in higher ed is because they, again, as I said, understand the power that we still have if we can harness it and use it. And I would like to see education and law deans do some powerful work together.
I want to just, the two of you hit the thread on the head, the nail on the head. And I think K-12 has, and we have our place in that, K-12 has completely failed in teaching young people how to discern truth from fiction in social media. And we have our place in that too. I mean, we have students write papers. I always tell them there's a difference between Google and Google Scholar. I don't accept Google. At least there's some checks on that because it's refereed pieces. But your point is exactly right. People don't know how to discern. I mean, I'm the equivalent of Albert Einstein about physics on the internet, and I don't know dit squat about physics. And that's a real problem. We have to teach people how to discern what's real from what's not real in this space. When Ferguson happened, that took off. I read a piece by a military intelligence expert who talked about the bots that took place that were sending misinformation out on an ongoing basis about things that were going to happen that weren't going to happen. And it raised the level of fear about what was happening there to extraordinary levels that didn't really have to happen. And so just a quick personal, I was invited to meet with some graduate students in higher education, actually, and I was asking them about, I was telling them this exact thing about, and they said, no, Doc, they said, you know, you don't know how, we're all really facile with social media. I said, really? I said, okay. I said, so when you read a paper, I said, do you look at the source of where it comes from? And they said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, do you know the difference? For example, I just said, have you ever heard of the Brookings Institution or different civil rights groups? And I mentioned some far-right groups. And they said, well, no. And I said, well, some of them are advocacy groups and some of them are research groups. And these are legitimate groups. Forget the illegitimate ones. And the kid looked at me after like 10 minutes of us going back and forth and said, you're right, I don't have a clue of what I'm doing, do I? And that was just dealing at this level. So I think that what we really have to do is get curriculum into the K-12 space and then around campuses to help people to discern what's real from what's not real. That's the part of the moral compass, I think, that we have in front of us. And that is a huge task because all the kids are on the media. Last point, there's a study just came out. Most people get their news from Facebook more than any other source that there is. And news that is inaccurate is 70% more likely to be retweeted than news that's accurate.
Universities, but you train those guys and gals who are going to be talking to 8th graders. Right. You're training those people. When you train those people, you're talking in multiplying factors. You're going to have, what, 50 students? 100 students? Can you imagine those 100 students that you have influenced going to a school in Lower Slobovia or Oshkosh, Wisconsin, will now have an effect. You're absolutely right. You have power. Use it. Thank you.